Welcome to the Education Pre-Hospital Care Research Forum Journal Club. Here in our PCRF Journal Club, we promote evidence-based practices by critically evaluating the latest science in emergency medical services. We hope our discussion will help advance EMS practice. Through the generous support of our sponsor, Limmer Education, we can make science more accessible and understandable. Okay, welcome everyone to the March 2024. Let's see if I can advance my slide here. There we go. March 2024 Pre-Hospital Care Research Forum Education Research Journal Club. The PCRF promotes research literacy to advance the science of EMS educational research. Here with the PCRF Journal Club, we take a closer look at some of the latest research happening in medical education. Thank you to Limmer Education for sponsoring these podcasts so we can bring you the best of science in education. I'm Megan Corey, and I'm here with Dr. Kim McKenna, Katie O'Connor, Michael Caduce, and soon to join us will be Dr. Bill Toon. Today, we're going to discuss this article published in the journal, one of my favorite journals, and I know one of Katie's, Simulation in Healthcare. This was in 2023, and it's entitled Using Simulation to Teach Learners in Healthcare Behavioral Skills Related to Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. This is a scoping review. Thank you all for joining us today. So we're going to begin. We want to remind you that you can use the chat and you can type in questions, comments, talk amongst yourselves as we bring those into the conversation as we go. So before we begin, we want to remind you that you can catch any of these podcasts. If you did miss us, you can check out our archives on our very own YouTube channel at youtube.com/@PCRF at UCLA. Don't forget to quote, tag, and share us on your favorite social media site, #EMS Research or @PCRF at UCLA. We also have, before we begin to look at this article, we do have a few announcements to make, and that's about some upcoming opportunities for budding researchers. The first thing that we want to discuss is an upcoming research workshop that is focused on health equity in EMS. So a great topic for what we're going to be talking about today. Great to announce this today. This comes out of a collaboration between the Pre-Hospital Care Research Forum and the CareStar Foundation. And if you're not familiar with the CareStar Foundation, out here in California, it's an organization that's committed to achieving health equity in our first response system. So if you can go to their website, CareStar, and find out more about that foundation. But this research will be, or workshop will be held on May 1st through the 3rd at UCLA campus. And you must apply. First, you can use the link that you see right here, and we can copy and paste that into the chat at some point during this so you can find out more about this. You can also go to the website for Pre-Hospital Care Research Forum, prehospitalcare.org, or you can go straight to UCLA Center for Pre-Hospital Care and go in that way to the Pre-Hospital Care Research Forum website. It's right on the facing page, along with an announcement about our next opportunity. And this is our annual opportunity. It's our annual call for abstracts. So remember the abstract deadline. We're going to remind you all the way up until June 30th, that June 30th at midnight, I guess Pacific time, this will close. So you have the time to, an opportunity to submit some of your data to potentially present at EMS World Expo in the fall in Las Vegas, Nevada. Abstracts are also published in Pre-Hospital Emergency Care. If you haven't seen that yet, in the January journal, right after NAEMSP's symposium, they published the abstracts from their research, and the ones from EMS World that have been accepted for this abstract call, they also appear in that journal. So it's great. It's a great opportunity. It's a great opportunity to get some research out there and then to network with other researchers. And that again is at EMS World in Las Vegas, Nevada. a lot of people get their start doing research by just, getting involved and going to either a workshop and, producing an abstract and then submitting it to the PCRF in June. So think about that. And if you have any questions, you can contact us at Prehospital Care Research Forum as well. All right, so let's get into this article. So we have discussed health equity, and we've reviewed some research on disparities in health outcomes and on access to quality care in EMS and in education. So one of the topics that has come up in our discussions is the potential relationship of bias, bias in the systems of care and in the provisions of care, bias of the individuals, and in the systems that are designed to provide high quality healthcare and optimize health outcomes. So efforts to address bias, those are mostly focused on improving individual self-awareness and attitude. For example, we've talked about this on this journal club. The implicit bias tests are commonly used to draw attention maybe to our own personal biases in the hopes that then we would reflect on how it might affect our patient care as we provide care. There's some research, though, that suggests that awareness alone does not translate into changes in patient outcome. So now this group of authors, and these are authors that are out of my neck of the woods, University of California at San Francisco. They were focusing on behavioral skills like communication, empathy development, conflict resolution. These are tangible behavioral skills that are measurable. So in the context of DEI, there are measurable tests that we could use then to develop these skills and then subsequently evaluate the impact on equitable outcomes. Now, they also go on to talk about how simulation is a powerful evidence-based teaching technique, and when used with structured pre-briefing and debriefing, they can lead to critical self-reflection and potentially behavior change. And we use this with procedural skills development and to build things like teamwork skills. So this is not something unusual, using simulation as a technique to develop a student. It's just that in medicine and EMS, we tend to focus on the procedural skills, the use of evidence-based practices or standards-based practices, and then maybe some behaviors, but without maybe a real grip on what we're evaluating in the end. So that's one of the things I really liked about this article is they applied some measurable outcome tools to their evaluation of articles. So we don't really know a lot about how to use simulation to teach behavioral skills. So this article then wanted to, and this was their research question, they wanted to look at the big, literature and the large literature and say, what simulation curricula are out there that have been developed to teach learners in healthcare behavioral skills that will promote diversity, equity, and inclusion, and what are their key educational components? So this is a study that really, it's called a scoping review. And I'd like to actually ask Mike and maybe Kim, Katie, you might have some experience here too. I've never conducted a scoping review or even been part of a systematic review of the literature, but I wanted to spend a few minutes just talking about this methodology. We've talked about the systematic versus scoping review, so maybe we could take a second and just review that. So Mike, would you mind starting us off on that?
Absolutely. I always thought of this as a giant literature search, and that's sort of how I think of a scoping review. Is we want to see what's out there, and I think oftentimes we see this in treatment pathways where it's maybe not feasible to design a prospective trial, right? So we can't design something where someone gets some treatment and somebody else gets another treatment that's potentially harmful. So we sort of have to look back and say, what does all the data say about this topic? I think the big takeaway for me on doing a review like this is your inclusion criteria is paramount. You have to be, you can get if your inclusion criteria are not defined, you can get a ton of articles, and then you have to start reviewing all of those to see what they say or to see if they fit whatever you're looking to study. So I think Kim has some good experience with this too, but my big advice on this is make sure your inclusion criteria are well defined to sort of limit what you're looking at.
Well, I actually never have participated in a scoping review. I think they go a little bit further, like where they kind of analyze it and sort of, kind of take away the lessons learned, kind of group it into different groups, sort of to get the big picture of what is it that we know about this topic. And so, they did a very good job of organizing this and of doing this. And I think their exclusion criteria were as interesting as their inclusion criteria here.
Yeah, and I'm going to put up this so those of you who can see the screen can see that here are their inclusion and exclusion criteria. So my understanding is that a scoping review will review also what's called gray literature, which is not necessarily, it might, correct me if I'm wrong on that, but you'll review, the literature that's not sort of your classic.
Yeah. I think of gray literature as like EMS World article or a GEMS article, right? It's probably sorted and it's probably cited, but there's probably not a robust peer review process. Maybe an editor's reading it to make sure your commas are in the right place, but and it's medically sound, but there's no peer review process. So yeah, it absolutely conclude all of these articles in a scoping review.
And in a scoping review, you don't necessarily grade the quality of the research that, whereas a systematic review, they most commonly will, right, use where they might use a tool that says, okay, these are the high quality research. Depends upon the research question, I guess. If you're just looking to see how much, how many randomized clinical trials have been done on something, you might do that. Have a big table of the quality.
Exactly. There's no 1A, 2B, 3C class recommendations in this review. In this review, and actually, the use of AI that we'll get into is really interesting. But I agree with Kim. The things they did include and the things they didn't include is quite interesting here, and sort of sets up for the maybe a broad stroke of we want to see all the information that's out there and then pull from it the consistencies or the commonalities between it. And I think that's maybe a little bit of the difference. This big review is looking for a scoping review is looking for like the broad stroking themes perhaps, whereas a systematic review you're really gonna classify best practices. So I think in this topic where there's maybe less knowledge out there,
Exactly.
a scoping review is the way to go.
That's a really important thing that you just said. So if you're out there thinking about it, you want to look at a certain topic, it's kind of an interesting thing because you're not going to launch a research study. You're going to launch a literature review first. And the literature review is not actually your research. Typically, it's the, the way that you begin to get your background. And so you look at what is out there. I think what you just said is really important. Then when you find out there's not a whole lot out there, then your question starts to develop that, well, maybe we can't even get to a study necessarily. Let's do a study that is a scoping review to see what is out there. And then the more information that's out there, maybe it turns into a systematic review, then a meta-analysis if there is a lot of other randomized clinical trials and other things like that, which is very different.
And I think the interesting thing in the methods of a scoping review is your goal of your authors is to get consistency in the articles that you're going to look at, whereas in either a meta-analysis or a systematic review, it's to get consistency of results. Whereas this study looks a lot more at methods and sort of what I see is like, what did they look at in terms of simulation education rather than what did they find? Whereas a systematic review, we probably spend a lot more time looking at results. This many patients with a whole blood transfusion survived. And so we'll look at, okay, this is all class 1A research. It's all prospective trials. And they found that 2 units of blood decreased mortality better than 5 units of blood or whatever.
Yeah.
This is just saying what's generally out there and can we get consistency that all of these articles do talk about simulation education and inclusivity in the classroom. And if all of the authors sort of have some agreement on a chunk of the articles, then they move on to the rest of the articles.
Yeah. Yeah. So the inclusion, I want to just go back to what we were talking about at the beginning, or a few minutes ago, which is the inclusion exclusion criteria. So they asked their question again. They're looking at what's out there in terms of simulation-based research on that's looking at behavioral skills related to DEI. So here's their inclusion. It had to be an educational curriculum. Needs to be related to the health professions. This is kind of an interesting one too. And they say including medical rehabilitation, dental nursing, medical assisting training. And they did put in the article a couple of paragraphs on their search terms and operands that they use, the ands and the ors and the different ways that they searched. And so, looking through there, you kind of look and see, do you think all of the types of allied health professions are included in that? A little bit of question about that. But then must use some type of simulation modality. And they go on in their article to say that they kind of broadly defined simulation, but I actually thought their definition of simulation, I don't know, Katie, if you had an opinion about that, but I thought their definition of simulation was spot on. I didn't think it was too broad. They looked for, there's a huge definition of this in here. So, Katie, do you have any thoughts
Yeah,
on
I thought it
that?
was great because they were like, look, yeah, I don't know if you guys can hear me, but I thought their
Yep.
definition was really, really good. They included everything. I think they were so inclusive of all different types of simulation. Part of the result is we couldn't find some of these simulation modalities. So like
Mm-hmm.
they were missing a whole bunch of the
Role
ways that
play
we
and
could simulate this. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. Role play is actually pretty common in teaching too. So essentially I was sort of surprised to not see a lot of that. And then I realized, oh, we're looking at research. We're not looking at teaching practices. We're looking at teaching practices that they took to research. So, and that's where kind of the gap is too, is we can do a lot of things in our classrooms and we can even go to professional development where we share these practices, but it's not every day that somebody's going to put that together in an abstract, hint, hint to people out there, and actually, present it as research. Kim?
I think, oh,
Go, Katie.
I think the other thing that maybe excluded some of the stuff that you and I are used to seeing was that if it was anything that was like about changing behaviors and attitudes, they didn't consider that a skill.
That's
So
right.
that to me was really interesting that they were like, oh, you're just trying to make people more accepting. That doesn't count.
Yeah. Kim, were you going to say the same thing?
Yeah, I completely agree. That sort of struck me as well, Katie. But I think that they were very intentional about that, right? Because they were like, okay, there's been a lot of stuff done on that, but now how do we teach people skills once they recognize that there are areas of bias? How do we teach them skills to be able to manage that during the medical encounter of some kind? But I was also going to say an inclusion criteria, something that surprised me was that tabletop simulation was included. Now, I think when I think of tabletop simulation, I think about, okay, a big board where we have
MCI.
little ambulances and little cars, and we're talking about a major vehicle accident or some kind of a mass casualty. But in the context of this topic, it was sort of surprising to me that not only did they include it, but they actually found one.
Yeah. Yeah. I thought that was interesting. I sort of can't picture it too. They did another thing to the author's credit. They put every reference in here. At the description, I didn't include that in the slides because you'd have to, squint. And you need a microscope actually. Anytime you get a scoping or a systematic review and they have the giant table of articles that kind of summarizes it. It's a great table, but it's impossible to present. So take a look at this article and you can see they give you references to all of those and then some. Then they also have an appendix where you can go to more detail about their articles that they looked at. Yeah, I did like that they must teach the behavioral skills. So to learners related to diversity, equity, inclusion. Bill's asking about programs in states that, well, this isn't EMS. This is sort of, and we can get into that because I'm sure I figured that would come up, the legislation and everything else. Right now this is really about, looking at, so in other words, what Bill is getting at is, let's say you want to do something and teach behavioral skills. Are you going to be allowed to if you're in a public educational institution in a state like Florida that has legislation that may prohibit that? I'm not, completely familiar with the legislation, just the news around it, which, always has a different flavor than the actual legislation, but it's a reality. So, and then it must have an abstract. Exclusion, you can see only lecture or didactic-based non-medical training surrounding identification of bias or detection of bias. They weren't looking for detection or awareness, self-awareness. They were looking for actual, tangible, measurable skills that were being taught or evaluated. And then not in English. So and that is always a limitation too. If you have, there may be some just phenomenal research out there that we don't know about that's just not translated into English. And then the primary focus of the curriculum being on clinical reasoning rather than on diversity, equity, inclusion, which, again, that would be the exclusion. And then this is your classic kind of table. This is and maybe one of you can mention and talk about Prisma. What is Prisma? As they mention it here, this is let's see, how about Mike? We were talking about this before. When they say, this is the Prisma.
We were, and I've actually looked at it because I was like, gosh, other
I know,
people
I can't
use
remember
Prisma. So I was like, I need to refresh my memory on what Prisma is. They have a pretty robust website, actually, because I was reviewing it earlier. It's a great way to do a document like this, but they have some standards, and it's all about openness in a thematic review. So making sure that the documents or the articles or the resources that you're sharing, you're making sure you're including the articles and you're not being implicitly biased in one direction or the other. For or against articles. So they give you a framework of how to do a search like this, which is really helpful. And their website provides some great resources on how to even create documents like this. So my knowledge on Prisma is limited, but their website's incredibly helpful and has a ton of resources on it. So if you do a Google search for Prisma and research, but in essence, it's all around trying to do this well, like a lit search like this or a scoping review like this really well.
Yeah, and it's nice. It provides guidance to someone, right? A researcher on how to do certain things. There's all kinds of guidance on if you're doing qualitative research or if you're doing research like this, a systematic review or a scoping review on what are best practices there. And so that helps you rather than just kind of going out there and doing a big search. So you can see these are the databases. And I don't know if anybody looked up the Web of Science, but we were talking about it before we started today. The Web of Science, and then your classic PubMed. And you have, Mike just put into the chat too, the Prisma information if anyone wants to check it out. So with all of this, they came up with 1,771 articles. And, oh, sorry, my dogs are interrupting here. The duplicates were removed at 721, and they ended up with 1,050 articles to screen. Not fun. They did exclude based on a title or abstract, and that brings it really down to 75 articles where you had DEI and simulation curricula. And then excluded because it was only an abstract. So they couldn't get the full article. They had to have the full articles. That brought them down to 60. And then we hit that 37 who were excluded because there was simulation and DEI, but there was not content teaching behavioral skills to promote DEI. And that's what they were really looking at. I would love to see those 37 articles, I will have to say, just to see what other things were being done. What were they using? Were these post-test, oh yes, I feel like I'm more aware reflections, and those, how do we know if that translates? I mean, there's research that says it may not translate into health outcomes, changes in health outcomes, but I thought that was, and that's an interesting little sidestep there. So your final pool is 23 articles, which is, you still got to read all the articles and go through and, all of the elements of them and describe them. And again, they already had an idea of what they wanted to pull from these. They wanted to learn about what were some of the characteristics of the articles, what types of simulation did they use, And so we're going to look at each one of these. Dr. Bill Toon has joined us. Thanks, Bill, for your comment in there. I'm wondering, you're a academic emergency medicine guy. The methodology of a study. Did anything strike you about this study in terms of its methodology before we move on to the results? I don't know if Bill can unmute.
Yes, I can.
Oh, there
It
you
just
go.
took me a minute. Took me a minute to find the unmute button.
Okay.
No, I have no comment per se on that aspect of it, but I know in the Society of Academic Emergency Medicine, they have the DEI is a real big important thing, and I know they've published research in that way as it relates to training in emergency medicine. It's that and bias in general, unconscious bias, all those type of things. That there's a lot of effort in that area.
Yeah, and it's interesting because a lot of people are kind of treating it like it's new, and I guess the terms or the acronym DEI is relatively new, but equity research has been going on for a long time. And differences in outcomes and disparities and social drivers of health, now called social drivers, which is social determinants of health. There's tons and tons of data and work in that area, in other aspects of medicine, mostly in the social work areas of medicine. So now some institutions have combined them, and I know that UCSF is one of them. They have an area called Siren, which is a social integration that's integrating social aspects and medicine, clinical aspects. Bill?
Yeah, one of the things I was wondering, and as I read this, is just the random thoughts that go through my mind, is I wonder if there would be a way to measure effectively at the beginning, and I'm going to keep it to our profession, EMS program, to know where someone's baseline thought process, everything, not only what do they think of, what's their knowledge of DEI, bias, all of this type of stuff, and then see if it improves or gets worse over the course of the training. Very interesting.
Yeah, and there's some great points that they're going to make in this about the frequency of training. I think that and just sort of frequency of, I don't know, even awareness. Oh, we might have just lost Bill. Okay, so this is the first table of results, and this one describes the demographic characteristics of the articles that were reviewed. So the publications, they actually did pull their reviews took place on, oh, and actually, excuse me, let me back up 1 second, because Mike, you mentioned it, and I didn't actually mention, I have it as a note here. One of the things that I was a little bit envious of is that they used AI, and we've seen this now in a few of these articles where they traditionally have been types of research where it's just a ton of hands-on work, like on the other end of the spectrum, the qualitative research. We've seen people using, and it's not just programs, they don't do the research for you, but they certainly help you sort them, natural language processing and other types of programs and stuff. And then in this one, they mentioned this Rayan, and I had to look it up. What is Rayan? And so Mike and I were talking about this. So Michael, do you want to?
Yeah, absolutely. It's described as an intelligent systematic review application. So I watched their tutorial video, and it's actually really interesting. And I think the key is what you said, Megan, is this isn't doing the research for you, but it is helping to find consistency among articles based on, it'll read the article. And actually, according to the system, you can sort of select, does it meet your inclusion criteria? Does it fall under a certain inclusion criteria? And it learns as you make your decisions and sort of works towards that process. Now, it's also appears to be a great way to organize. So you put all of your articles into the system, and it's just an organizational program where, I would have, if it were me, I'd have stacks on my desk of different piles of research. It sort of does that for you electronically and provides you some research. I think it's important to note, this isn't AI just going through and doing this. As I think some of us have nightmares of AI. This is a platform allowing you to do the research and have an organized way to see the research. I sort of think of EndNotes as the same thing. thing. Like it technically
Yeah.
has some AI features to it, but really it's just tracking your citations and moving them around as you see fit. So it's interesting. They have a website. It's RAYYA, and I'll throw the link in the chat. But appears to be a very interesting platform in terms of helping you organize your thoughts. But then it does do it. I think the other thing I noted too was they did all researchers or two of the researchers reviewed all of the abstracts independently, and then came back and had some discussion. So I think from that standpoint, they did follow sort of the the methodology we like to see in a scoping review. But there's lots. I did a PubMed search for this Ryan, I think. I don't know how you say it, but I did, and it's published, and like lots of people are using it. So cool.
Yeah, I know. How jealous are you, Kim? I know I am. We're sort of the same research generation where it was a lot of hands-on work, and same with Bill, where it was a lot of incredibly arduous work.
Exactly. Like, when you do like focus groups, for example, and it used to be you had to manually transcribe everything, and then you had to read everything and pull the themes out and to organize them and everything. And now even Zoom will, make a transcript for you, or you could, use other programs that will make the transcript for you. And then, it just has sped the process up so much to eliminate those manual steps that those of us that never had really research resources, access to research resources, had to do just manually.
Yeah, do you remember you could pay a transcriptionist? So, and a lot of graduate students paid a transcriptionist.
Yeah, they did. They did. Luckily, my dissertation research was, I don't know if that was lucky or unluckily. It was quantitative. So
yeah,
that presented different problems. But yes, I do know that people made a living off that.
Yeah. And now we have
anymore.
Now we have people that do that too. We have Remley and Tony and people like that we can call for the quantitative. But
right.
Yeah, but to Mike's point, that none of it does the research for you. It certainly takes the load off of a lot of the difficult parts of it, and then you get to use your brain for the rest of it. So let's get back to this then. The demographic characteristics. So the public, they did the searches on September 20th, 2020, 2021, and then again, February 2022. They're trying to sort of collect to see if there is anything published all the way up until the time that they stopped and began to do the reviews of their results. So the publication date ranges you can see here, I don't think there's anything earth-shattering about that. There's 23 articles. The health professions, a large proportion of them are in medicine. That to me reflects the resources committed to simulation-based learning, and also the highlight and it actually also kind of underscores the value system too, the value of that profession in the area of health equity. So health equity, like I said, has been around for a while. And so medicine, it's not surprising that is the area that you see most of these articles come from. Interprofessional, it says, and one of them, I didn't read to know what the interprofessional areas were. And then nursing, and then just a couple in dentistry and pharmacy. So not too surprising there. I probably would have expected more in the area of nursing, but I would imagine in those 37 articles that were excluded, there might have been a clump of nursing. And then your learners were students. So the majority of them were students, which is good. That's your initial, training. And then medical residents, postgraduate learners, 6 of them, and then a combination of the 2 and 4 of them. Okay, so then that's the characteristics of the simulation that's in the curriculum itself. So what did they describe as the actual, what is simulation? They used simulation as the main teaching modality, which I thought was interesting. Maybe, in residency, that doesn't surprise me, but in the initial training in the student population, that would surprise me. So I wouldn't be surprised if that number 12 was from sort of more of the continuing education area. And then simulation as a portion of the larger curriculum. This was about split. So didactic lab simulation, that's a little bit more classic for your initial training. This one was, actually, I guess I'm not surprised about this because most of them were in medical education, but the majority of them, 16 out of 23, were use standardized actors. So standardized patients, or SPs, that you see in the article they'll refer to, were used. So I want to stop there for a second and just ask about, one of the things I think we could better develop in EMS is standardized patient programs. Where, I don't know, I'm in initial training, so I'm always speaking from that voice, from the initial paramedic training, initial EMT training, pre-licensure, pre-certification training. And standardized patient use just doesn't happen. In terms of like actually the way a standardized patient is in medicine, the standardized patient is usually another student, right? Is that fair to say for those of you who've done initial training? Pretty classically, it's another student.
I would say 90% of the time that's true. We were lucky enough in the last few years that I was in my department to recruit some people that had been trained on the local CERT teams.
Oh,
And
great.
they were people that really wanted to volunteer in the community, and they weren't all 20.
Yes.
And they,
yes.
some of them actually had same color hair, gray hair as I do. And one young woman had a disability. And so although they weren't standardized patients in the true sense, where they're specifically trained to portray a particular behavior or illness or whatever, they contributed so richly to the education that it was invaluable to us. We started them out as volunteers, and they were so valuable. We eventually included them in the budget. They were paid.
Yeah. Claudia Clark is putting in the chat that they use standardized patients about 25% of the time and have a grant for them. Claudia, if you have any details about which type of grant it was, and that's great, because one of the things I looked into also was like using Perkins funding and other things, but they'll only allow you to really hire students. Oh yeah, so we were, but I guess, when I think about that, students can be of all ages at a community college. So, Michael?
I would agree. Most of ours are other students. While not standardized patients, they certainly filled the role, which was former students. I think sometimes we forget that those people are valuable resources if they want to give back and they have some time. The article notes the difficulty in getting standardized patients, make sure they're trained and they're not causing trauma to the learner in the end, which I think is really important. But at least bringing back some former students who have been through the program recently, they've had some similar lived experience, and they sort of know where the simulation goes if you're doing the same simulation over and over. A little bit more difficult on the paramedic side if you've got classes that run for 9 months. Your former students are out in the field, but we found that to be useful. They were sort of maybe a pseudo standardized patient, if you will, in that they knew what they were supposed to do and they got a pre-brief, but not the training that we oftentimes see in our medical school standardized patients. They are truly actors and actresses where they've memorized like scripts and things like that.
Yeah, thanks so much, Claudia, for putting that in. It gives me hope. And they were able to get the standardized patient grant with Perkins money, and they're not hiring students. They have quite a few retired, which is great. I think that's a tremendous thing. You can actually put some data together.
I'm available. Just have to pay my way, but
yeah, Katie, you used Built-In. You did it virtually during COVID.
Yeah, and that was actually something that our students loved. They felt like they finally were actually talking to real patients. They were doing a lot of the students were the patient, and they just couldn't get their mental framework out of knowing the fact that this was their classmate they sat with every day, because that's the visual cue that they keep getting. But Bill came on. My dad actually was a patient. I had to download Zoom on his iPad for him, walk him through it over the phone so that he could learn how to Zoom to be a patient. But he was just answering questions that were the things that he normally goes through because he's got a whole bunch of medical problems. So it was really realistic, versus sometimes we have when we use students, they're great, but they visually look to the proctor or the facilitator of the sim for answers and cues.
Yeah.
And that just, I think it really just changes the cognitive load for the person who's in the simulation, because it breaks the fiction contract.
Yeah.
So when you have SPs, it really is a very different thing than just like a simulated participant. But the price is just not there. Like it's so expensive to do that. The training cost and like opportunity cost. What else are you not doing in your program if you're spending money on SPs? Which I think they're great. I think that's wonderful. I just think in EMS we don't have the budget for that.
Well, EMS is done on the cheap.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I was hearing it in my head. I'm glad you said it.
Yeah,
So, but
go,
we
Bill.
know we know there are better ways to do things. The challenge I know that exists is how do we create the funding to do it? Because if some of you can't change your tuition, it's set by the governing body that you're with. When I ran a paramedic program back in the 80s, I was charging $5,000 for it. And the community college across the river was like $1,800. So where do students go? But I was able to pay preceptors. So that's where their money went, is I used that money to pay preceptors, and it makes a big difference. So and medical education is expensive because they know what it takes to create physicians. We just don't have that same, we're challenged. We're greatly challenged by our funding structure for our education.
I just wonder why we're doing it separately. Why does EMS need our own, and why does, especially if you're in a school that has 7 other healthcare programs and we constantly talk about interprofessional
Yeah, what a great way
training.
to do it is to take that money and pool it so you have a group of actors to draw from, and there are programs that have medical schools even nearby. So that's an excellent point. Collaboration there.
The actor can start in the field, can end up in the, emergency department. They can get go to a clinic or be greeted by the, medical assistant. And, there's so many layers to it. It can be an ongoing thing, but there we go. Role play was also the other one. And actually they did have some role play in here. I don't know why I thought they didn't. Multiple methods and tabletop were in here too, but the standardized actors stood out to me. One thing we don't see here, what do we not see? We don't see Sim Man in here.
Yeah,
So.
because, they just presented this research at the NAMSP2 conference, and it's the research that I did. But when you use a mannequin, you don't have DEI characteristics in the sim. It's so strange, but like they're just not. Whenever you throw a mannequin in there, they just become, the white guy who skipped leg day at the gym. So
yeah, which is interesting because you could have a standardized and we've done it. You have it. The standardized patient is actually what they used to call the Confederate, which is the patient's bystander or family member or whatever. And Sim Man can be the one in respiratory distress, and the other language speaking son or daughter is the person that's of the Sim Man there, and you can incorporate certain things into it. But I think we get stuck with what are we looking at and how do I know as the faculty member, which gets to Mike's point, which was they talked about faculty training and a lot of this. So, and psychological safety. They didn't put that in the tables, which I was a little disappointed about that. There's a couple of really important descriptive characteristics of the content of these, that 57% of them, of the articles, which was 13 of them, discussed pre-briefing, 18, which is 78%, discussed debriefing. Now, just because they didn't discuss them doesn't mean they didn't do them, because, pre-briefing and debriefing are evidence-based practices and simulation. So, but they did discuss those in their articles. And then 4 of them discuss psychological safety. And I would think in an area like DEI, especially in the areas where where you're going to see in just a second, that psychological safety would be at the top of a consideration, to make sure that we're not perpetuating. Same with faculty training. And that was about 52%, half of them described training for facilitators. of the simulation that were focused around ensuring that we're not, perpetuating stereotypes and making matters worse. So that was sort of one of the things that I thought was really interesting. And then, here we go. This is the same issue we have, one educational session. The majority of them, 19 out of 23, one educational session. Longitudinal education program, 4. So, and we know lasting change doesn't happen from one educational session. So these are the curricular contents that when they described all of these 23 articles, that the topic of bias, and I was surprised at this, but again, it might be that the 37 excluded or others had different topics, but gender identity and sexual orientation were 7 out of the 23. Then there were multiple topics, and then it was kind of a smattering: language, ethnicity, race, disability, body habitus, age, socioeconomic status were all in there. So no real one topic, but these were sort of the focused areas on and behavioral skills that they measured. You can see the skills that they implemented, communication skills, history taking skills. I guess when you think about history taking skills, gender identity, sexual orientation probably have, again, some clinical aspects that they're incorporating into it, but that's really not what you're necessarily getting at. And then there's systemic or community level advocacy, which I thought was another interesting thing, about 10 out of 23. So these were the content areas. But again, there were that whole idea of you've got to train your faculty or the facilitator of the simulation in this as well. That's a whole other area. Okay, let's see, there was, this is the table I wanted to sit on for a second, because one of the things I think is powerful about this, these results is it is showing us that there are standardized evidence-based ways to evaluate skills, communication skills, behavioral skills, basically. And so when they looked at these articles, the curricular evaluation by the learner, so you always have the learner evaluating the curriculum. 10 of the 23 looked at their confidence with the skills, their preparation, the familiarity, which is not unusual. That's a little bit kind of like a satisfaction with their own, confidence and that kind of thing. Then the utility of the training, did they find it useful? Qualitative comments, self-reflection, journaling. I always think of Kim when I see self-reflection. But then they used tools. They used actual validated tools and not surprisingly, the OSCE, which is the objective structured clinical exam, I think. The OSCE is used in medical school. So Kim or Katie, you'll be getting used to that one, the OSCE, pretty soon. And then these other ones that were used, the multidimensional cultural humility scale that focuses on 5 domains of cultural humility, which is openness, self-awareness, egoless, supportive interactions, and self-reflection or critique. That was used. Kim?
I was looking at that one because I thought, gosh, if you were to design something for EMS, and, I think Mike or somebody said that earlier, like do a before and after using this scale, but it's like 57 items. I looked it up. It's like 57 items. So you'd really have to be kind of committed. But it would be a very objective way because it's been analyzed. They've done factor analysis on the dimensions of the score, and it's validated. So I think that's a great option. If you have the time to do a study like this in EMS, it would be fantastic.
Yeah, and I think if you have a team of people too who are interested in these, in DEI issues and how to train, how to teach in this area, then we have validated tools. And I think that's why this is really my favorite part of this study, was it points to we have guidance not only in how to, I really like this article, as you can tell, because we have guidance for researchers on how to actually do in a scoping review and how just based on how they did it. And then you also have pointing to, well, we have these validated scales out there that some people are using.
Yeah, I mean, and it measures more than just did they like it. I always go back to the Kirkpatrick scale, that the lowest level is did they like it? Do they have more confidence or whatever? And then, assessing, did they learn something? Did their behavior change? And then the next part, which they talk about a little bit later, is did they transfer it into the place that they work? Were they able to transfer those skills, which is the next sort of higher level thing? And then outcomes, which would be very hard to measure in this case. But I just think I love that they picked those validated tools in this study.
I know. And sometimes I think if you just to use cardiac arrest as an example, I think we can get obsessive about a single intervention and its impact. And what we really know kind of in our heart of hearts is that it's a collective set of interventions that can impact. For example, how many decades did it take to develop high quality CPR, chest compressions, and then to know that if you put them out there in the hands of anybody who is going to most likely to see somebody collapse, then we're more likely to see better outcomes. And, now using the DEI modification of that, we're seeing the differences in outcomes based upon where the patient is, what kind of neighborhoods they're in, what kind of participation, a person trust they have in the healthcare system, that kind of thing. So we get focused on the one intervention, and so I think it may be that it's a collective, and that we just may shift the needle on the gaps in health outcomes based upon a whole collection of things. Katie, did you have something?
Well, I was just like looking at these tools. For me, I'm thinking about how we probably just need to shift like the thought process and design behind some of EMS education, because the things that they were talking about here that worked well was like giving participants more time after these types of simulations and having faculty for them to reflect back on. And granted, they had a lot of these one-offs, but even just these scales and these validated tools, they're a lot of things. And, it's a lot of different checkpoints. We do sims and it's like they have 10 minutes on scene with the patient and they've got to have like these 5 things done. And then we're going to just like do 10-minute quick debrief and then we have to run another one. And it just doesn't give you even the time to talk to the patient and, even be able to get through 54 different things. Like I always joke in EMS education, we are coming at every patient encounter like they're about to die, right? Like you got to do your primary assessment in 30 seconds. Like this person could be dead. And nursing and, medicine, where we're seeing most of this happen, comes at it from the patient's healthy, right? Like they don't start off with this like timer, like, oh my God, if you don't get off scene in 10 minutes, it's the end of the world. So I think like shifting the paradigm to realize we really don't deal with emergencies and emergency medical services the majority of the time. Like we have plenty of time, it's the new stuff with like lights and sirens. Like we don't need to be running everywhere and just scooping and running and being like, okay, what's your gender? I need to fill this out my form so I can get to the next like page. Just slowing stuff down. I think we need to change this paradigm.
Yeah. And in education, I think slowing it down, in the debriefing, there's sort of the debriefing and moving on to the next, the debriefing on the immediate simulation, but then there's expanding that debriefing to sort of the social aspects. How do we keep this elderly patient from coming back to the hospital? How do we keep from coming back here again? If we're on a scene and we run this simulation, we run this call, one of the follow-up debriefing questions might, have more to do with some of the things that can prevent recidivism or coming back there for the same type of emergency, doing the environmental scan and that kind of thing, which is certainly in our training. That's in the foundation training. I just don't think we insert it into simulation much.
No, and I was just at a conference in Oregon talking about these topics because they let me pick what I wanted, and of course I went to DEI. But I had asked a whole group of these EMTs if they'd ever practiced just asking people about their sexual orientation, their gender, all of that. Like they were like, no, never had a sim on that. But every single one of them has like practice doing CPR to the end of the world, and but we never even gave them an opportunity to ask these questions, and they're just afraid of making a mistake because they never practiced it.
Yeah. And we, you and I talked about this too before when we talked about death notification and other things like that. You can do things where it's a 2-minute, it's an assignment to create an audio or a video or something where you're demonstrating an example of how to assess a patient or how to, do a death notification. And but you're first trained on it and using the tools that come out of medical social work and have been published. Actually, they've been published in a lot of our common EMS journals about how, guiding the student and how to, what tools to use to guide your death notification or breaking bad news. And so that doesn't have to be a full on simulation. That's the other thing I think we get confused at in EMS education. You say simulation, they think, all right, get out the makeup, set up the noises and the smells and everything else. Like, no, you can actually, that's why I love their definition of simulation here. A role play is a simulation, practicing how you say things to patients is a simulation. So a couple of these other ones. Oh, so go ahead.
Oh, no, I just think the other thing too is there's a lot of research now coming out around the gender or the differences in age, and that the students that are coming through really see DEI as an issue and like a lived experience versus a lot of the people who are older who are teaching like don't have those same attitudes. And they're just saying that even if you just like give the students a space to ask questions, or you make this part of the curriculum, like that is going to make them trust you more, be more open, like have the psychological safety because it is validating what they've experienced.
Yeah.
So I just thought that's really interesting. Like if you don't have to do a huge simulation, maybe do something really short, but open the space so that people have the ability to ask these questions.
And provide the feedback. I actually really would love to know from my students too, is there, what about the teaching practices here, makes it, and have you ever had an experience in the year and a half you've been here where you felt unsafe, where it's an unsafe space for conversation and what did that surround? And just to feedback to educators as well. So yeah, that opportunity for our own reflexive practice. So couple of these tools I just wanted to mention too, and if you don't have access to the article, these tools are you can get the tools themselves. They're used. The advocacy inquiry score rates participants on their exhibited behaviors to interrupt power, which I really kind of like that. I want to look up that one. Master interview rating scale. That's for interviewing students with using communication skills like open-ended questioning, transitional statements, avoiding jargon, using empathy cues. That one, I really think that EMS educators would know how to use a tool like that. So that might be a useful one. And then the assessment for professional behavior, which is uses specific behaviors like interpersonal communication skills, professionalism, giving feedback to healthcare professionals, things like that. Those are a little bit more, common on the communication behavioral skills scores. So a lot of tools in here, a lot of things for us to pull from it. And I think it was a really good, they also make a point in here in their discussion session alone is worth a read about being, not just highly selective in choosing diverse facilitators and co-facilitators, but recommending rigorous training for facilitators to navigate those conversations. And I think in EMS, I know we would probably welcome it because if I had to translate attitudes of some educators, I think it's mostly who may seem like, oh, we don't need to do this. I think that if you really, peeled back the surface, it would be, I really don't know how to do this. And it's uncomfortable and I would appreciate some training on it.
Why are you looking at me while you make that statement?
I'm actually looking at myself. Oh, yeah. Anything else that they talk about deliberate practice in here too. I don't know if you saw that, but continued cycles of feedback and reflection using simulation and using deliberate practice in assessing these types of skills as well as your procedural skills. Kim?
I think just going back to what Katie said, I mean, we don't spend enough time teaching people how to have uncomfortable conversations, whether it be about DE&I topics or topics that we're not really familiar with, or violent situations, for example, how to de-escalate. We don't spend enough time on those things. We spend a lot of times on those motor skills, but things that can really make a difference, we probably are ignoring way too much.
I agree. So what a great way to close out here. I want to thank the panelists. It was a good discussion, and thank you all for joining us. Remember that you can join us again next month, Friday, April 26th. We're going to be looking at improving pediatric procedural skills for EMS clinicians. This is a longitudinal simulation-based curriculum with this novel remote first-person viewed video-based outcome measure. So we'll be looking at a little bit of simulation again next month, but you can join us earlier than that for the Clinical Podcast Journal Club on Monday, April 8th with Dr. Remley Crow, Dr. Tony Fernandez. And remember to join us live each month. You can register at prehospitalcare.org, and don't forget to visit the YouTube channel if you want to watch some of the past episodes. Thank you all very much for attending, and we'll see you next month. We hope you have enjoyed and learned from this PCRF Journal Club. Please share it with other interested EMS professionals. An archive of past journal clubs can be found at www.pcrfpodcasts.org. You can also find us on Facebook at PCRF at UCLA and on our website at www.prehospitalcare.org. A special thank you to our sponsor, Limmer Education, providing education tools for success at every stage of your EMS journey.